Every time a pope enters the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's frescoes remind him that he will have to answer to God for his leadership of the Catholic Church. That's why it's here that the Church holds the meetings or conclaves to elect the successor of the Apostle Peter. Joseph Ratzinger entered this sacred hall as a cardinal and walked out Pope Benedict XVI.
Annuncio vobis gaudium magnum. Habemus papam.
Dopo il grande Papa Giovanni Paolo II, i signori cardinali hanno eletto me, un semplice, umile lavoratore nella vigna del Signore.
The Pope's first decision is to choose a new name, which indicates the style of his pontificate. Ratzinger chose Benedict, a 4th century saint who preserved and passed on the culture of the ancient world through his monasteries.
Christianity in that world was a kind of small presence, but it was a small presence that had a large impact because of its passion, its commitment, and its unity. And I think this Pope Benedict sees the contemporary situation of Christianity in something of the same way. The world in which the Church set the tone, the world in which the Church dominated the culture, is over.
But the new name also evoked memories of a pope who'd governed the Catholic Church 90 years earlier, Benedict XV.
I remember Pope Benedict XV, that courageous prophet of peace, who guided the Church through turbulent times of war. In his footsteps, I place my ministry in the service of reconciliation and harmony between peoples.
Pope Benedict XVI is from Germany, the key player in the last 2 world wars. Yet he began his pontificate taking the name of a defender of peace. Benedict XV warned the countries involved in World War I that it was a useless slaughter, and once it was over, he urged the victors not to humiliate their adversaries. But they didn't heed his advice, and Germany's wounds never completely healed. 20 years later, World War II broke out. In September of 1939, Hitler invaded Poland. Joseph Ratzinger was just 12 years old, but witnessing his parents' suffering, he knew that tough times lay ahead.
The Ratzinger family was anti-Nazi from the beginning. His father actually resigned. He took early retirement as a policeman to avoid being sucked into the brown shirts and being sucked into the National Socialist movement.
By now, Hitler had already silenced almost every free voice in Germany. Those who didn't agree with the regime disappeared off the map. Then Hitler intensified propaganda, militarized life in the country, and forced children older than 10 to join Nazi youth groups.
It's very hard to understand how totalitarian societies, how they grab, I mean, they know that the treasure of every family are the children, so they want to have the children.
The young Joseph Ratzinger was involuntarily enrolled in the Hitler Youth. That is, he was enrolled against his will. And as a matter of fact, he never went to a Hitler Youth meeting, and he never picked up his membership card.
The Führer intended to turn German culture into a one that was fanatically Nazi. As the regime organized book burnings and sent intellectuals to concentration camps, the young Joseph discovered classical Greek and Latin literature.
From July 44 until May 45, more people died in this war than all the other years, from 39 to 44. So it was a horrible story, and it was the total mobilization of Hitler. And he took Volkssturm, it meant they took the 60, they took the old and they took the children, they took everybody.
In 1943, the Nazi regime forced young people to join the anti-aircraft artillery. Joseph Ratzinger, then 16 years old, became an aide in an anti-air battery near Munich.
Hat selber erzählt, war sehr schwach immer, sehr schwächlich und kränklich.
He told them that as a child he'd always been weak and thin, that he wasn't very strong, and that he was only good at math. It seems calculations had to be done at some point. He wasn't able to carry munitions because they were too heavy for him, so he did the lighter work.
Eher sozusagen leichtere Arbeiten verrichtet dabei.
When he returned to Munich, he suffered, seeing shattered lives and houses in ruins. He felt the same desolation months later in Vienna and Salzburg, two cities he loved for their culture and musical tradition. One night in the barracks, recruits were woken up abruptly and ordered to line up. One official called them one by one and asked them if they wanted to join the SS voluntarily. Joseph said no, since he wanted to be a priest. The SS official and his fellow soldiers insulted and mocked him. Toward the end of the war, Joseph deserted the military, even though he knew he risked being shot immediately if discovered. He even ran into a patrol, but since his arm was bandaged, they let him go. A few months later, the Allied forces arrested him in his house and put him in an open-air camp for prisoners of war, along with 50,000 ex-soldiers. In his bag, he carried a pen and a notebook. He distracted himself by writing poetry in classical Greek. He took solace in seeing the faraway towers of the Cathedral of Ulm. That view reminded him of the humanity of religious faith in the face of the brutality of those years.
He has gone through the experience of war and of humiliation. And when everything collapses, when that word that was false collapses, what remains? What can you do in order to preserve the respect for yourself? We could say that when everything was destroyed in Germany, what remained were the cathedrals.
Nazism had destroyed the country. Later, Soviet communism, also based on lies and abuse, would turn the eastern half of Germany into a prison. All these life-changing events reinforced young Joseph's desire to dedicate his life to spreading truth and peace.
At that time, every soldier coming back from the war had to prove that he had a job, to ensure that no one was idle, but that everyone participated in rebuilding the country, which was largely destroyed. The rector of the seminary said, to avoid going somewhere far away, where you are not feeling at home, why don't you come here and rebuild the seminary? We have plenty of work for you. And so my brother and I went to the seminary and helped to clean and repair it.
Those years ended in what he describes as the most important day in his life. It was June 29th, 1951, the feasts of St. Peter and Paul. Cardinal Faulhaber, whose solemn character and fervent opposition to the Nazis had made such an impression on him, laid his hands on young Joseph and ordained him a priest. From the beginning, Joseph stood out because of his gift for teaching. His bishop soon asked him to teach future priests. At the same time, Joseph began to prepare for an entry exam to teach at the university. Little by little, his dream of being a professor was becoming a reality. But an academic setback nearly upset all his plans. Ratzinger presented a paper to the university on St. Bonaventure, but a famous professor challenged it because he considered the thesis too innovative. That rejection would mean not being able to teach in the university. Ratzinger solved the problem by presenting the less controversial chapters. The tribunal unanimously accepted his work, a testament to its academic validity. And so began a time in his life that he fondly remembers, the years he spent as a university professor. In 1959, he became the chair of the Department of Theology at the University of Bonn.
And he wasn't cut out to be a bon vivant, he wasn't a very social butterfly and so on. Where he felt most at home was with books and in intellectual conversation. I think he felt that's where he could make his contribution.
The reputation of the young professor soon reached the ears of the cardinal from Cologne, Joseph Frings. He called him as his theological advisor during the Second Vatican Council, convened by Pope John XXIII, to open the windows to let fresh air into the church. Cardinal Frings and Joseph Ratzinger lived here in the Austro-German College in Rome, close to Piazza Navona. The council appointed the young theologian as an expert. He worked on one of the great church documents, the dogmatic constitution on sacred scripture and revelation, and it made him a star in theology circles. In 1965, Pope Paul VI closed the council, and the Catholic Church began to apply its teaching.
After Vatican II, Pope Paul VI said that there were two German-speaking theologians that he had met at the council who would be heard from in the future. One was the Swiss theologian Hans Kung, the other was the German theologian Joseph Ratzinger.
After the council, Ratzinger went back to life as a professor. By now, he was teaching at the University of Tübingen. The winds of the student revolution of 1968, widespread in all of Europe, finally hit the peaceful city. University groups sought to forcefully impose their ideas and even block professors from entering lecture halls. Professor Ratzinger felt this climate made real debate based on truth and mutual respect impossible.
And it was an echo, and this really, it horrified him. It certainly horrified him. And I mean, they came under the sign of liberation, the revolutionary liberation, but he knew quite well what it sounded like. I mean, the sounds was much more Nazi-like than many of the leaders of them had Nazi parents. And so it was much more of a totalitarian movement than anything which had to do with liberation.
Searching for real academic freedom, he moved to the University of Regensburg in Bavaria, where his brother and sister lived. Regensburg is a picturesque city on the Danube River with deep roots in music. For years, his brother Georg directed the famous boys' choir of the cathedral. After 10 years, when he reached intellectual maturity and was able to make a lasting contribution to theology, Pope Paul VI asked him to make a great sacrifice, to give up his academic career to become Archbishop of Munich. Indeed, it was a difficult decision, since he was at the pinnacle of his academic career and was convinced that he'd make a better professor than bishop. But he accepted.
War 50 Jahre alt.
He was 50 years old, very young for an Archbishop of Munich and Freising, and at the same time he was chairman of the Freising Bishops' Conference.
At first, we were of course sad, not as one would think, that one would be happy and jump for joy. On the contrary, we knew of course that our fraternal community could no longer be the same, but that there would be a separation of sorts.
After spending 25 years searching for and explaining the truth as a professor, he chose a motto for his coat of arms that defined his mission: Cooperatores Veritatis, co-workers of the truth. He went on teaching the truth not at the university, but in the cathedral. During those years, the philosopher Józef Pieper advised him to write to a young Polish bishop, a hero of the resistance movement against Nazism and communism, a certain Karol Wojtyła. Ratzinger sent his book, Introduction to Christianity, to Krakow, and Karol Wojtyła quoted from it during the spiritual exercises he preached to Paul VI. Ratzinger and Wojtyła continued to exchange books over the years as they assumed greater responsibilities as cardinals of Munich and Krakow. But their first personal encounter didn't take place until the conclave after the death of Paul VI in 1978. After 4 rounds of voting, the cardinals elected the Patriarch of Venice, Albino Luciani. He took the name John Paul I in honor of his 2 predecessors, John XXIII and Paul VI. The world called Luciani the Smiling Pope, and he surprised everyone with a new style of leadership. During general audiences, he used to call on children and invite them to ask him questions. His pontificate is one of the shortest in history, lasting only 33 days. His death moved the world, and the cardinals went back to the Sistine Chapel to elect another successor to Peter. This time, 8 rounds of voting were necessary. John Paul II came from Poland. He was 58 years old. A philosopher, yet young and athletic, he was the ideal pope to take the new evangelization to the world through countless trips. The new pope contacted the Archbishop of Munich. He wanted him by his side as prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Ratzinger only asked for one thing: permission to continue writing books. John Paul II granted his request and even encouraged him to continue his personal theological research. Their joint effort led to encyclicals such as Veritatis Splendor on morality and Fides et Ratio on the complementary nature between faith and reason. But his work as prefect turned Ratzinger into somewhat of a villain.
One thing about being prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith is that by definition it makes you the doctor no of the Catholic Church. That is, it is your job to say no.
Ratzinger had to respond to the traditionalist theologians who refused to accept Vatican II. At the same time, he also had to deal with those who preached liberation theology, which promoted a class struggle in the name of God.
Cardinal Ratzinger participated in that criticism, as I do, that we're silencing people as if that's an intention to silence them. Actually, the work that we do with regard to defending Catholic teaching, Catholic doctrine.
As cardinal, as prefect of the famous Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, he wanted to protect and defend, to preserve the faith, above all for simple people.
John Paul II and Joseph Ratzinger embarked upon the so-called purification of memory. They asked for forgiveness for the practical errors of the Catholic Church throughout history. In 1984, they restored Galileo's name, 340 years after an erroneous condemnation. During Lent in the year 2000, John Paul II presided over an historic ceremony in which he asked pardon for the faults of the past. Cardinal Ratzinger was at his side.
Anche uomini di Chiesa, in nome della fede e della morale, hanno talora fatto ricorso a metodi non evangelici nel pur doveroso impegno di difesa della verità.
Pope John Paul II had asked him to deal with complaints of sexual abuse by priests in the United States. From Rome, Cardinal Ratzinger oversaw the canonical processes that led to the expulsion of priests who were found guilty. He dreamed of spending his later years studying in the Vatican Library and writing a book on Jesus of Nazareth. He presented his resignation to John Paul II 3 times, but every time the Pope rejected it. And as Cardinal Deacon, he was to assume a key role during the last few months and days of John Paul's life. On the night of February 1st, 2005, John Paul II suffered serious breathing problems, and the doctors admitted him to Rome's Gemelli Hospital. Hundreds of people flocked to the hospital, leaving him gifts and greeting him from below his window. In mid-March, the Pope went home to the Vatican, but his aides soon announced he would not participate in any of the Holy Week ceremonies. He asked Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger to write the text of the traditional Way of the Cross at the Colosseum. The Pope followed the ceremony from his Vatican chapel while clutching a cross. In one of his meditations, Ratzinger asked forgiveness for the sins of Catholic priests.
Quanta sporcizia c'è nella Chiesa. E proprio anche tra coloro che nel sacerdozio dovrebbero appartenere completamente a Lui. Quanta superbia, quanta autosufficienza.
From his window, an exhausted John Paul II greeted crowds 3 days before his death. It was the last time the world saw him alive. The news of his condition spread. His spokesperson was overcome with emotion.
Il Papa lucido, straordinariamente sereno, con la logica relativa a difficoltà di respirare, immagine nuova.
Thousands of people rushed to St. Peter's Square to be as close to the Pope as they could. On Saturday, April 2nd, while thousands of people prayed the Rosary in St. Peter's Square, the world received the news. John Paul II was dead.
Che il nostro silenzio orante accompagni questi primi momenti dell'incontro del Santo Padre Giovanni Paolo II con Cristo nel cielo.
As Dean of the College of Cardinals, Joseph Ratzinger presided at the moving ceremonies during those days, including the state funeral, attended by leaders from all over the world who put aside differences to honor John Paul. The strong wind blew through St. Peter's Square, as if nature too was saying its goodbye to the Pope.
Possiamo essere sicuri che il nostro amato Papa sta adesso alla finestra della casa del Padre, ci vede e ci benedice, si ci benedica, Santo Padre.
Sancta Maria Mater Dei.
A few days later, 115 cardinals entered the Sistine Chapel to elect a new pope. Every cardinal swore on the Bible to vote for the person he thought best to run the Catholic Church. Before the conclave, some cardinals asked Ratzinger to accept the position were he to be elected. He thought himself too old and not strong enough to be pope. He was 78 years of age. He figured he was out of the running since there were many younger cardinals who were well prepared to assume the responsibility. The doors of the Sistine Chapel closed and voting began. After 3 rounds, or scrutinies, and 2 black smokes indicating no clear winner, grey smoke began to billow from the Sistine Chapel's chimney. Then slowly, it became white.
I no longer went to answer the phone because it rang and rang, and always there were journalists on the other end, asking the same questions 100 times. But Frau Heidel went to answer it, and suddenly she recognized that at the other end of the line there was the Holy Father. When I finally talked to him, there was nothing different about it. Our fraternal relationship has not really changed. It was just my brother, and we spoke as we always have.
His first visit as Pope was not to the papal apartments, but to his colleagues at the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, where he'd worked for 23 years. They received him with applause and a cake.
Ancora quasi non posso credere di stare adesso su un altro posto e si è realizzato quanto il Signore ha detto a Pietro: in un tempo posteriore tu sei guidato dove non volevi andare.
That same day, he went to his old house to prepare his first speeches. He said goodbye to his neighbors, almost all fellow cardinals, and greeted hundreds of Romans who were waiting to see the new pope up close. A few days later, heads of state and leaders from all over the world attended a mass inaugurating his pontificate, an emotional rite that began a few steps from the tomb of St. Peter the Apostle. Benedict was the successor of Peter, number 264. During the ceremony, he received symbols of the papacy: the fisherman's ring, to put his seal on pontifical documents, and the symbol of the Good Shepherd, the pallium made of sheep's wool. This time, it was a pallium identical to what was used in the first millennium, before the division of Christians.
Il mio vero programma di governo è quello di non fare la mia volontà, di non perseguire le mie idee, ma di mettermi in ascolto con tutta quanta la Chiesa della parola e della volontà del Signore e lasciarmi guidare da Lui, così che sia Egli stesso a guidare la Chiesa in questa ora della nostra storia.
After the Mass, he received Germans who'd come to Rome. He asked them to be understanding if he made mistakes.
Ich bitte euch Nachsicht, wenn ich Fehler mache wie jeder Mensch oder wenn manches unverständlich bleibt, was der Papst von seinem Gewissen und vom Gewissen der Kirche her sagen und tun muss. Ich bitte euch euer Vertrauen.
His leadership style was evident even in the new papal coat of arms. He exchanged the triple crown, symbol of earthly power, for the mitre, symbolic of bishops. The ancient papal states were long gone, and presenting himself as bishop opened up new ways to be united to other Christian churches. The The Bavarian symbols of his episcopal coat of arms remained: the Moor of Freising and the bear of St. Corbinian, the first bishop of Freising. The shell is the symbol of the pilgrim and of faith. It harked back to another lover of truth, St. Augustine of Hippo, a saint to whom the Pope feels very close.
Augustine was a man who wanted to dedicate his life to study and was called to serve the needs of the church. And it's almost as if Pope Benedict, when he said that, was reflecting in his own life what happened to Augustine, how he himself, as he crossed the age of 75 and then 78, was hoping to dedicate the rest of his life to study and was called to serve the church as universal pastors, our Holy Father.
Ratzinger said that he'd take a copy of the Bible and St. Augustine's Confessions if stranded on a desert island. When he visited the saint's grave in Pavia, in northern Italy, he made clear the saint's influence on his life, not only as a theologian, but also as a man and as a priest.
Sia la mia personale devozione e riconoscenza verso colui che tanta parte ha avuto nella mia vita di teologo e di pastore, ma direi prima ancora di uomo e di sacerdote.
Popes don't include mottos in their coat of arms. Just like John Paul II, Benedict XVI did without the motto he'd chosen when elected to the See of Munich, co-workers of the truth. But his guiding principle continued to be the truth, which he considers the solution to the world's problems. An example is his first message for the World Day of Peace: in truth, peace. He says that lies are seeds of hate and that the truth promotes peace. Being Pope may be the hardest job in the world. Benedict XVI begins each day celebrating Mass in the same chapel as his predecessors. There, before beginning his day's work, he entrusts the world's problems and all his priorities to God. Few world leaders have so many direct lines of information as the Pope. Every day, he receives heads of state, bishops, and other visitors from all over the world. They all speak to him of pressing problems and others that are less known. They're not all solemn moments. The visits are full of humanity.
Very difficult to so many manifestations. We're going to have a lot of parties, I think. I'd come just from Brussels now.
The interview was very successful, I hear.
Yes, but it was a long night. It was a very long night.
Every day, his secretaries bring him a summary of the world press. And after dinner, he watches the evening news. Every day, he meets with Secretary of State Cardinal Tarcisio Bertone to prepare his appointments with world leaders. Behind closed doors, he reminds them of their responsibilities towards the weak and vulnerable in their countries. He asks for more attention to families and greater efforts to protect the environment. Yet, even after a few years as Pope, very few people have a feel for who he is.
He communicates better than virtually any other religious leader one can think of. And yet, on the other hand, you know, in terms of the mass media and in terms of the world outside the church, you know, sometimes he is not always at the top of his game.
He isn't a hero. He isn't Batman. He isn't a Superman. So you can say it like this. You can say sometimes he is a little bit weak, or he needs to react immediately. But yeah, he waits. He loves to wait.
He became Pope at age 78, a difficult age to become the successor of John Paul II. Many doubted that the timid Benedict would connect to young people. The first test, World Youth Day in Cologne, Germany, in August of 2005. When 1 million young people arrived on the shores of the Rhine to welcome the Pope, all those doubts disappeared. Cologne received masses of pilgrims who'd been camping 20 miles outside the city. In 24 hours, the square of Marienfeld turned into a city brimming with hundreds of thousands of young people. Like the ancient pilgrims of old, the young people spent the night under the stars as they waited for Benedict XVI to come back for Sunday Mass.
Freedom is not simply about enjoying life in total autonomy, but rather about living by the measure of truth and goodness, so that we ourselves can become true and good.
In May of 2006, the first German Pope after Nazism remembered the victims of the Holocaust at Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland. Benedict XVI crossed the threshold of the infamous concentration camp on foot, alone. Above his head hung the monstrous lie of the Nazis that prisoners saw as they entered this place of death: "Work will set you free." A manipulation of a line from the Gospel: "The truth will set you free." Then, in the enormous extermination camp of Birkenau, he prayed before the memorials to the Holocaust. Messages in the various languages of the victims, a few steps from where the crematorium ovens were located.
Dietro queste lapidi si cela il destino di innumerevoli esseri umani. Essi scuotono la nostra memoria, scuotono il nostro cuore. Non vogliono provocare in noi l'odio. Ci dimostra anzi quanto sia terribile l'opera dell'odio.
When he approached the last stone, a rainbow appeared in the place where the greatest mass murder in history took place. His next trip was to Bavaria, something more than an apostolic trip, since Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger defined himself as a Bavarian patriot. He seemed to be rejuvenated when he visited the places of his childhood, the cheerful songs of his native land, famous for its beautiful landscapes, beer, Baroque art, cutting-edge technology, music, and above all, optimism. Benedict XVI made a pilgrimage to the Catholic heart of Bavaria, the shrine of Altötting. He prayed at the feet of an image of the Black Virgin, where his father had once prayed for the safe return of his sons, Joseph and Georg Ratzinger, during the war. Before leaving, the Pope left his cardinal ring as a gift. During those days home, his only living relative, his brother Georg, accompanied him. For a few hours, he visited his house in the Pentling neighborhood and his beloved University of Regensburg to give a keynote lecture. That visit to the university would be critical to his pontificate. In a speech, he quoted the words of a Byzantine emperor. Those words gravely offended Muslims. His speech provoked protests and controversy all over the Muslim world. The Pope clarified that he didn't want to offend anyone. And upon his return to Rome, he immediately received ambassadors from Muslim countries. The tension continued to grow, and some Turkish authorities suggested cancelling Benedict's trip to Istanbul, scheduled for just a few months later. The Pope did not cancel the trip, despite concerns about what could happen on his first visit to a country with a Muslim majority.
Lo scopo di questo viaggio è il dialogo, la fraternità, un impegno per la comprensione tra le culture, per l'incontro delle culture e delle religioni, per la riconciliazione. Tutti sentiamo la stessa responsabilità in questo momento difficile della storia e collaboriamo.
In order to dispel any doubts, the Pope visited the majestic Blue Mosque in Istanbul. He took off his shoes to enter and prayed to the merciful God, facing Mecca together with the Grand Mufti. That gesture achieved what no speech could: peaceful relations with Islam.
Şimdi yeni bir papa var. Bizim tarafımızdan baktığımızda
His relationship with Muslims did not begin well, but sometimes things get off to a bad start and then end well. His words had emotional consequences, but we have to leave them to one side and forget this clash and pursue peace together.
Hepimiz bu duygu çatışmasını bir kenara bırakıp barış için birlikte olmalıyız.
Shortly thereafter, he received King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, the guardian of the mosques of Mecca and Medina, and one of the greatest figureheads in the Muslim world. It was the first time a king of Saudi Arabia visited a pope, a promising sign for future peaceful coexistence. However, the first objective of Benedict XVI is the search for unity among all Christians, highlighted in his very first speech. In Istanbul, he met with the successor of the Apostle St. Andrew, Bartholomew I, Ecumenical Patriarch of Constantinople, primus inter pares, among the Orthodox patriarchs. He too is committed to reaching unity. Benedict XVI renewed John Paul II's invitation to study ways of exercising the primacy of the Pope in a way that's acceptable to other Christians. Little by little, the ice has begun to thaw. Other leaders of Orthodox churches have made historic gestures, including many firsts. The first visit of the Orthodox Archbishop of Athens to Rome, the first visit of the Archbishop of Cyprus, and the first visit of the number 2 of the Russian Orthodox Church, the biggest Orthodox church and also the most reticent in the dialogue with Rome. The Pope believes this dialogue, based on truth, will also help solve the troubling situation facing China's Catholics. The hostility of the government towards the Catholic religion has created a patriotic church controlled by the Communist Party and an underground church which is brutally persecuted. In June 2007, the Pope sent a letter to all Catholics in China urging them to restore unity.
We admire such a balance between the passion for the truth and the loving kindness of the Holy Father towards everybody.
In the same letter, the Pope told the Chinese government that the Church is not trying to change the political regime, but wants to establish diplomatic relations with the present government as it has with 176 countries. But Beijing did not respond, and 24 hours after its publication, it took the letter off the internet. In a world marked by intolerance of those who promote the truth, Benedict XVI raises the flag of professor, and he adjusts his language according to his public.
Devo confessarmi tutte le volte che faccio la comunione, anche quando ho fatto gli stessi peccati.
È vero, di solito i nostri peccati sono sempre gli stessi, ma facciamo pulizia delle nostre abitazioni, delle nostre camere, almeno ogni settimana, anche se la sporcizia è sempre la stessa, per aver pulito, per ricominciare. E altrimenti forse la sporcizia non si vede, ma si accumula. Una cosa simile va anche per l'anima.
This man was the Darth Vader of the Catholic Church. You know, when he walked into a room, people would hear that Imperial March from Star Wars. You know, dun 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 dun, because he was the great disciplinarian of the church. Now he is the great pastor of the church. This is the man who was writing encyclicals on love and hope.
I do think that this Pope has what we call a paper trail that is endless. And I'm sure that once he gives the speeches, when we look back, we will find it was there all the time, but we just didn't see it.
Like every intellectual, he likes to get down to the fundamentals. He spent a summer vacation in northern Italy writing his first encyclical, God is Love. A guide to understanding the most basic characteristic of God, and an invitation to help others through another name for love, charity. In his second encyclical, Saved by Hope, Benedict XVI warns that a world without God is a world without hope, and only with openness towards God can the difficulties in life take on meaning.
Com'è possibile sperare quando la realtà nega ogni sogno di felicità, ogni progetto di vita?
Sì, c'è speranza. Anche oggi siete importanti ognuno, perché ognuno è conosciuto e voluto da Dio, e per ognuno Dio ha un suo progetto. Dobbiamo scoprirlo e aiutarlo reciprocamente perché sia possibile, nonostante queste situazioni di precarietà, di marginalità.
He is a man of deep reflection, and he doesn't spend much time in socializing, so to speak, because he has the sense of his main contribution to the life of the church. He is a doctor of the church.
Benedict thinks that many problems in the Catholic Church come from not speaking often and cheerfully about God. That's why he wants to remind the world that Christianity is above all something joyful and positive. It's the message of his first book as Pope, Jesus of Nazareth, the fruit of study and personal meditation. In it, he wants to remind the world of the basic element of the Gospels, that Jesus Christ is God.
It has become extremely well received among Lutherans. So there are seminars in the Lutheran seminary for educational pastors on this book, and lots of interest, and they are very surprised that Christ is so central to the Pope. So sort of they have some ideas that Catholicism sort of put Christ far away from theology.
The theologian Pope is also a human Pope. Pundits define him as a different kind of Pope, different but not distant. He tells people who are suffering that he's with them, especially the sick. The first time he went to a hospital, he went to visit his brother, who was getting a pacemaker. The Pope also visited children at the Bambin Gesù Hospital in Rome. He greeted the children in their rooms, accepted their gifts, and consoled their parents. He went to a soup kitchen run by the church in Rome, where they invited him to come back whenever he wants. He's visited the house where Mother Teresa's nuns tend to the poor people around the Vatican. During his moving trip to the United States, he prayed with victims of the September 11th attacks in New York and asked for the terrorists' conversion. While he was in the most powerful city in the world, he also requested a special meeting with the sick. At the shrine of Loreto in Italy, he stood up to hug Ilaria, a 26-year-old who told him that she'd suffered violence inside her family. She explained that she became anorexic until a priest helped her both humanly and spiritually to fight her disease. During a visit to a drug rehab center in Brazil, the Pope was visibly moved after hearing the story of a street child, Ricardo Ribeirinha, who tried to kill himself during a crisis of withdrawal. Amid tears, Ricardo revealed what hurt him most, that his friends couldn't be with him since drugs had killed them.
Aos 9 anos descobri após uma briga familiar que era filho adotivo. Mas a dor de saber que era filho de uma prostituta e do abandono me consumiu apesar do amor que tinha no meu lar. A escola, os brinquedos, o sorriso, a liberdade, todos foram trocados aos poucos pelo mundo da cola, da maconha, da cocaína e do crack. Tráfico de drogas, assalto e muita tristeza foram o que eu encontrei como resposta da busca da tal liberdade.
He sees family life as the best means of preventing problems. He reminded thousands of families from around the world of this in Valencia, Spain. He said helping families is a priority for a better future.
La familia es un bien necesario para los pueblos, un fundamento indispensable para la sociedad, es un bien insustituible para los hijos, que han de ser fruto del amor, de la donación total y generosa de los padres.
Nicht der Beethoven-Typ, der revolutionär ist.
He is not the Beethoven type, a revolutionary and a fighter. What you can see in him is not the typical pattern of a Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. A struggle of the will, the fight that passes from darkness and danger to victory. For him, instead, the key is not to miss the spiritual aspects of life and to find joy in it. I think this would be the best way of characterizing his way of being.
Having lived many years, Benedict XVI knows that violence is not the right way to change the world. He's experienced that the power of truth is much more effective. He's convinced that art and music convey some aspects of truth better than words. And so he searches for beauty in theology and through his love of music, which brings him closer to God. He is a pope who relies on God. He's an intellectual who trusts reason. He's a man in love with truth.